Olga Puzanova, and I am a lecturer at the Department of International Relations and also a researcher at the International Laboratory on World Order Studies and the New Regionalism at our faculty. So today we are very honored to welcome Professor Barry Buzan, and the topic of his talk is Deparochialising IR, benchmark dates from a global military perspective. I'm very honored to give an introduction to Professor Buzan. He is Emeritus Professor of International Relations at the LSE, formerly Montague Burton Professor, Honorary Professor at Copenhagen, Jilin and China Foreign Affairs Universities, a Senior Fellow at LSE Ideas and a Fellow of the British Academy. He took his first degree at the University of British Columbia and his doctorate at the London School of Economics. From 1988 to 2002, he was project director at the Copenhagen Peace Research Institute, COPRI. From 1995 to 2002, he was research professor of international studies at the University of Westminster. And before that, professor of international studies at the University of Warwick. He was chairman of the British International Studies Association, 1988 to 18, oh my gosh, I'm doing a lot of teaching on the 19th century now, so excuse me, 1988 to 1990. Vice president of the North American International Studies Association, 1993 to 1994, and founding secretary of the International Studies Coordinating Committee, 1994 to 98. From 1999 to 2011, he was general coordinator of a project to reconvene the English School of International Relations. And from 2004 until 2008, he was editor of the European Journal of International Relations. Professor Buzan has made a significant contribution to IR theory. His thought has helped to shape international security studies since the 1980s, and the English School and the international historical sociology since the 1990s. Being a leading figure of the Copenhagen School, he developed regional security complex theory and helped to develop and promote Oliver Weber's theory of secularization. He is considered a major figure in the English School of International Relations theory, where he's identified with clarifying structural approaches to the study of international and world society. Professor Buzan, and this is very impressive, has written, co-authored or edited over 25 books, written or co-authored nearly 150 articles and chapters, and lectured, broadcast or presented papers in over 20 countries. Now, his most recent books include An Introduction to the English School of International Relations, The Societal Approach, that is 2014 with George Lawson, The Global Transformation, History, Modernity and the Making of International Relations, 2015, Global International Society, A New Framework for Analysis, 2018, with Laust Schauenburg, The Making of Global International Relations, Origins and Evolution of IR, at its centenary, 2019, and Rethinking Sino-Japanese Alienation, History, Problems and Historical Opportunities, that is 2020. Professor Buzan is currently working with Tarek Bakawi on a new IR periodization from a global military history perspective. The point of his new paper is to question the standard West-centric benchmark dates that are widely used to structure teaching and thinking about IR, that is 1648, 1815, 1919, 1945, and 1989. These are all hinged around big wars centered on Europe and take little or no account of the global South. The paper asks what sort of benchmark dates we would get and why if we took a perspective from global rather than European military history. The relevance of this is that we are rapidly moving out of the Western era in IR and need to start thinking about how to periodize IR in terms of relevant to global international society as a whole. Professor Buzan has agreed to present the preliminary results of this paper today as a thought experiment. Now, we would appreciate if you could write your real names here for security reasons. And if you would like to ask a question, please indicate that you wish to do so in the chat on the right-hand side. Thank you very much. Now we give the floor to Professor Buzan.
Thank you very much. Well, as you suggested, this idea for this paper hinges around the notion of benchmark dates. And you mentioned 1648, 1815, 1919, 1945, 1989. Anybody who teaches or writes in international relations will be extremely familiar with those dates. Lots of the books you use to teach from, and perhaps lots of the books that you've written, will be hinged around those dates, because it's the conventional way of periodizing the subject. So dominant has this become that I was amazed to find that even my colleagues in China use 1648 in teaching international relations in China, when of course that date is a very parochial European one and has no consequences for China whatsoever. Now, George Lawson and I, and hi George, I think I can see you out there somewhere. George Lawson and I began puzzling about all of this quite a long time ago, and we wrote a variety of pieces thinking about why these benchmark dates exist. Why are they so influential? Nobody ever seems to have thought much about them. They just get used. They are also used by international historians, which might explain some things. But no explicit criteria are given for these. No criteria are around by how you weigh them one from another. Should we give more weight to 1945 than 1919? Well, who knows? So these dates just sit there. They are very influential in the way we think and teach and research the subject. They are all, of course, very Western dates, so they support the Eurocentric pretense that Western history is world history, and they're all the ends of major wars. So they give a very particularly military cast to how we think about organizing the subject. Now, George and I were mainly annoyed by the military side of this, although we were also annoyed by the kind of Eurocentrism of it. So much of the work that we did was about moving it away from the military dimension. So we wanted to introduce ideational and economic and technological changes as other possible factors that might deserve benchmark dates. And we made a particular argument for 1840 as representing the onset of modernity, which was a huge change in the whole of the international system and society. What Tarek and I are trying to do is, it's related to that, but it's a different thing. So we're actually going with the military focus. You know, Tarek has that expertise much more than I do. So the question we're asking here is, okay, if we just accept for the time being the military focus is an interesting one, but then try and take the West and Eurocentrism out of it, what does it then look like? What would we get? So this requires drawing on global military history and trying to see what from that you would identify that might be suitable for organizing and periodizing the subject in the same way that the standard set of Eurocentric dates does. Right? So that's the nature of the project. It's still at an embarrassingly early stage, so we're just thinking our way through this. And today's talk is basically going to be a look at 6 possible candidates for this. In a sense, we're working backwards here. We're thinking in a fairly broad way about what kinds of global military history dates might qualify here, and then hoping that once we can think about that, we might be able to work backwards towards establishing the kinds of criteria in a general sense that you might use for choosing such dates. So at the moment, things are relatively broad in that. The criteria is essentially about durable changes in the material or normative structures of the international system and society. We want to exclude parochial events. So I mentioned 1648 as a parochial event. I don't think that counts. Neither should the transition from the Ming to the Qing dynasty in China, which happened at around the same time. But that's largely a Chinese affair with not much consequence for the world. Another criteria that we decided just to kind of keep the thing manageable was to start from the 15th century. By the 15th if one were going back in time, would be the not much talked about Battle of Talas in 751 AD, in which the newly installed Abbasid Caliphate defeated an allied army mainly led by the Qing dynasty in China in Central Asia. That was the first and the last time that China had a major military encounter with any of the other agrarian civilizations. And in a sense, the outcome of that battle shut China out of Central Asia and out of regular contact with the rest of the world. That would be an interesting one to look at if you were taking this further back. You might want to look at the Greek defeats of Persia, which are another kind of iconic moment, perhaps better known, where you could argue that this had a substantial influence on the way the world worked out. But we're not doing that. We're just sticking with 15th century and beyond. And although I do feel a little guilty about not having a kind of systematic set of criteria for making these choices, bear with me. There's no systematic set of criteria for making the choices of 1648, etc., either, because these things haven't been discussed. Right? So it's a pretty general approach, and here's what we get for the 6 topics. Okay, the first date would be 1453, the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. We think this is an interesting date for a variety of reasons. I mean, first of all, it was hugely symbolic in the Islamic world. The Islamic world in its various political forms, right from its beginning, had been trying to conquer Constantinople and failed on innumerable occasions. The war had become a kind of ritualistic thing in which the caliphs rode off to fight the Byzantines every year with no particular great outcome on either side. So when Constantinople finally fell, this was an enormous symbolic event. It not only gave the Ottoman Empire the most splendid capital in the entire Islamic world, but it gave them a huge amount of prestige for having done that. Strategically, it had quite big implications in the sense that the fall of the Ottoman Empire finally removed the protecting shield that the Byzantine Empire had provided between, as it were, the Islamic world and medieval Europe. It opened up a couple of centuries in which the Ottoman Empire was, in some senses, the main existential threat to Europe. Lots of European images of the dreaded Turk. The Ottoman armies laid siege to Vienna twice. They had an entirely different organization from Western armies. They were composed of slave soldiers. They were extremely good at the use of artillery, perhaps world leading in their day. So this particular date, represents a quite significant turning point between, as it were, 2 areas of civilization. It also underlines the fact, about which I'll say more later, that although the Europeans like to flatter themselves with the idea that they've been on the make, dominating the world since the very early 16th century, and that somehow what later became their military superiority had existed more or less for the last 500 years, this is basically not true. I mean, the Ottoman case, you know, the last siege of Vienna was in 1683, which is not all that long ago by these standards. Other of the great classical empires were still expanding at this time. So the Qing and Mughal empires were still expanding well into the 16th, 17th, and even 18th century. So this seems a date which both registers an important event which had big consequences, and also underlines the falsity of the European claim to be world dominating in a military sense, right from the early 16th century. Okay, that's the first one. The second one, this one's for Russia, is 1689 and the Treaty of Nerchinsk, which effectively closed the steppe. Okay? This is something which I guess most people don't think about very much unless you have a very long interest in classical history. But by the 17th century, China and Russia were both what's called gunpowder empires. And as they expanded, Russia south and east, and the Chinese north and west, as they expanded, they eventually met. Their frontiers were more or less set by this treaty. And this was, in world historical terms, this was a seriously enormous event in the sense that if you look at the history of the steppe was really good at generating exceptionally effective and efficient warriors and warrior empires. And these warrior empires were regularly able to defeat for thousands of years, since about 2000 BC. They were regularly able to defeat the armies of the big sedentary empires from Rome to China without all that much difficulty. They were better equipped in terms of military technology. They invented chariots, they invented cavalry, they invented the compound bow. They deserved the reputation that they had, and they were a very serious military force. The closure of the steppe ended this dynamic in which steppe empires would periodically arise and quite often take over the rulership of the big sedentary empires. So the Qing dynasty in 1644 is an example of steppe warriors becoming the rulers of a major sedentary empire. And so is the Mughal dynasty in India from 1526, yet again, really quite recent events. So this expansion of the Chinese and Russian gunpowder empires finally ended the dominance of the steppe cavalry warriors and closed what in some ways was the major military and political dynamic of Eurasia for thousands of years previously. So firearms were, in a sense, the key to undoing the military effectiveness of the light cavalry and indeed the heavy cavalry of the steppe peoples. So that, I think, is a good candidate for a second benchmark date in global military history terms. Okay, the third one, and I should say that some of these dates are point-in-time dates, right? The two I've just given you are quite specific dates. But these things can come also as sort of short wars, 1914, 18, something like that, which is what the third one is going to be, or they can be tipping points in a long sequence. I think the significance of 1648 in the European context is not that the treaties of Westphalia are so interesting in and of themselves, but they're a good tipping point in the emergence of the modern European state from the more medieval structure of earlier times. So in a sense, they're the midpoint in a process that may have lasted a couple of centuries. Okay, so this third one is 1519 to 1521. And this is the Spanish context of the Aztecs. This is a fairly well-known story, told amongst others by Jared Diamond. And in a strictly military sense, it's not particularly interesting in the sense, okay, fairly advanced Iron Age people beat fairly advanced Stone Age people. It's not exactly headline news in terms of military accomplishments. And Jared Diamond, in his well-known book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, tells that story very well. One of the interesting things about this story, though, is that it's one of the things that feeds into this Western myth that the West was militarily dominant globally from a very early point, early in the 16th century. Because this date is, in a sense, the exception, not the rule. Defeating the civilizations in the Americas was relatively easy on both technological and biological grounds. And the reason why this date deserves to be considered in this exercise is that, as many have argued, I mean, particularly Pomerantz and Morris have argued that the European acquisition of the Americas tips the global balance in the long term by giving much more wealth and power to Europe in comparison to Asia. It gives them vast amounts of resources, vast amounts of land. As Neil Ferguson argues, it turned whole continents white over a period of a couple of centuries, and therefore substantially changed in the long term the global balance. And this is the main reason for picking this date. Now, the next one moves on a bit. It takes us into the 19th century, and this is a little bit, in some ways, closer to the work that George and I did, although pitched in a slightly different way. This is again a short war, 1839 to 42, the first Opium War, in which Britain, or rather mainly forces of the East India Company from British India, defeat China militarily and force China to open up in a variety of ways to Western economic presence. And this date, I think, does mark the actual ascendancy of military modernity as held by a small number of states, mainly European, and also a bit later Japan. So if you want a claim of European stroke Western plus Japanese core military superiority, this is when it begins. Okay? A few decades earlier, the well-known Macartney embassy to China had basically been rejected by the Chinese, and the Chinese could do that. They could just say, go away, basically. We're not interested in what you have to sell. And if you don't want to recognize our emperor as your emperor too, that, well, too bad, go away. A few decades later, Britain is able to defeat this kind of greatest of the classical empires with hardly breaking sweat, right? Because the British are equipped with modern artillery and steamships, and the Chinese have absolutely really no answer to this and are fairly quickly and thoroughly defeated. So this is what ends what in effect were 3 centuries of something close to military equilibrium in Asia, in the Indian Ocean and in East Asia, where the Europeans certainly had very little in the way of an obvious military advantage, except at sea. They had better ships and to some extent better guns, but they had no real ability to penetrate significantly onto land in Asia, either South Asia or East Asia, until the 19th century. So this event, it seems to me, opens up a bit more than a century of an absolutely decisive military superiority of the core over everybody else. Right? So a handful of modern military powers could, without too much exaggeration, it could be said, they could basically do what they liked. They could beat anybody up, they could occupy anybody, they could take anybody over, they could punish at will, and often did so. And this underpinned a whole round of new imperialism in Asia and Africa. And in the 20th century, these industrial powers could and did on various occasions simply use the world as their battlefield. Right? So when you read the histories of the First and Second World War, there are British and German and Russian and other armies marching around the place in the Middle East and in South Asia and in the Far East. These core military powers effectively owned the world in terms of doing what they wanted militarily. That's not to say they were never beaten, but they didn't lose wars. Right? They might lose the occasional battle, but in the end, they could always win. So they had, from this point onward, the very decisive military advantage that they like to claim is 500 years old, but is actually much less than that. So this date signifies an era in which world politics was dominated by industrial great powers competing worldwide for empires and spheres of influence, and really facing relatively little consequential opposition in doing so. So it opens up a period, okay, of more than a century of a very lopsided military balance in the world. And my next date relates to that, and it's a bit complicated. Here, there isn't such an obvious specific date that one can pin down, but the thing that I'm looking for here is the end of this period of unquestioned military dominance of the core. It runs for at least 100 years, but what kind of event symbolizes its demise? I'm going to put forward 1975 and the defeat of the United States in Vietnam as good a tipping point date for this as any. Basically, this is about, or mainly about, the increasing difficulty for the core powers to occupy and hold territory elsewhere in the world. Now, you can see that beginning to come into play even in the 1930s. I think any of you who know the story of the Italian campaigns in Ethiopia during the 1930s. The Italians had they'd been beaten in Ethiopia before, and they had a pretty desperate time of it trying to beat Ethiopia again, even in the 1930s. You could pick 1945, decolonization. The British are no longer able to hold on to India, and Asian empires and a bit later African empires begin to fall apart, and the idea of imperialism itself begins to become illegitimate. But that to me seems a bit too early. There's too much in the counter-narrative to that. I mean, the Korean War, and indeed much of the Cold War and many of the interventions made by the United States and the Soviet Union and others during that war looked pretty much like the old-style military superiority of the West and of Japan. But there's a lot of examples of the increasing difficulty for the core to hold territory in the periphery. Okay, so I've mentioned Britain in India, France famously failing to hold either Indochina or Algeria, the United States failing to overthrow Castro at the Bay of Pigs in 1961. the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, having the experience of many others in Afghanistan, that you can take over the capital, but you can't control the country or occupy it, something which the Americans then subsequently learned yet again after 2001. Ditto the American experience in Iraq after 2001. On the other hand, the Americans were able to beat Saddam twice pretty easily, so they could still do the big invasion thing, but they couldn't hold the territory. Right? So the military superiority was still there in some ways, but it was becoming ever less decisive. The attempt to use air power to keep this Western superiority really didn't work, and that's one of the reasons why Vietnam is a good example, because nobody could possibly have had more air power than the Americans in play in that war, and they still couldn't really hold territory in Vietnam. So air power, whilst it has all kinds of uses for wrecking things, was pretty useless to try and sustain any kind of occupation. So for me, I think 1975 is as good a tipping point date as any for this, because it meant that the biggest superpower in the system was comprehensively defeated by a relatively minor country, albeit with external support from China and the Soviet Union. But the Americans couldn't do this, no matter how hard they tried. But they couldn't really use nuclear weapons because that just wouldn't have been appropriate to this kind of task. So even though the West retained military advantages in some way, and some other countries like the Soviet Union had these as well, these advantages were no longer as useful as they had been in easily and cheaply occupying territory. Probably the key, or one of the keys to this, is the diffusion of light infantry weapons, particularly, of course, the famous AK-47, which is still going strong out there. Because once these kinds of weapons were easily available to all and sundry, then occupation against resistance became increasingly expensive and difficult. And given anyway that imperialism had been delegitimized after the Second World War, this whole package of things began to become unglued. You might want to think that another element in this would have been the acquisition of nuclear weapons by, first of all, China, but then later India and South Africa briefly, and North Korea and others who have been closing the gap on this. And that is an element here in ending Western military superiority. But it seems to me that most of these countries, possible exception of China, still wouldn't have a chance in a major shooting war with a Western power. But what the Western powers can't do is occupy. So it seems to me that's the key, and that Vietnam is a good symbol for that. So that would be 1975, my fifth take. The sixth one, George will have a laugh at this because it's quite recent. And in the work that we did on benchmarks some time back, we put out a warning saying, really, we think there should be a 30-year rule about declaring anything a benchmark date, because otherwise, how do you know what the significance of something it is? It might feel big at the time, but how do you know? Things could have moved on in some quite different way, and what looked like it was going to be very significant turns out actually not to be. So, warning given, okay? Yellow card on this one. But the argument is for 2001 and the declaration of the Global War on Terror. Tarek has the nice line of thinking about this as World War IV. I'm not quite sure I go along with that, but the drift of it is interesting. It seems to me the thing to focus on here is that the particular declaration by George Bush of a war on terror did a very interesting thing. It basically elevated non-state actors to the status of legitimate partners in war. War, up until that point, had been mainly thought of as something that was done by states with each other, and that in order to be party to a war, you had to be a state. Now, we have to take into account the fact that the Americans like to declare war on everything from teenage pregnancy to drugs, and therefore they're a bit loose in the use of this word. But nonetheless, what seems to have become embedded here with the global war on terror is that non-state actors have been given this status of equal partners in war. This is a very strange move, but it is possibly a very significant move if it means that the main focus of violent conflict amongst entities at an international level has moved from state to state to state versus non-state. That's an extremely significant move, right? And at least up until now, the empirical evidence seems at least suggestive enough to support that this might in fact be a long-term shift. We don't see so much in the way of interstate wars, although they are still threatened from time to time, but not that much is done about them. But we see, all manner of so-called wars between states and non-state actors. This means that war itself, if this is now the main thread of war, war has become deterritorialized, right? Which is a very dramatic shift. There are now no fronts in the same sense that there used to be fronts, that if you're trying to fight with an outfit like Islamic State, you have to do so, on the streets of your own cities, in all kinds of obscure, out-of-the-way places where state order is not very strongly present. So there are kind of holes in the fabric of international society where these kinds of actors can take root, like in Sahel at the moment. It also seems that if the direction that war is going in, then we are looking at a deinstitutionalization of war. If you follow English school thinking on this, maybe some of you do, there seemed to be a pretty strong historical trend to boxing in the legitimacy of war. So if you go back to the 18th century or so, or even the 19th century, you could use war at the drop of the hat for almost anything. You wanted to conquer something, you conquered it. And if you could conquer it, it was yours. So basically, there wasn't too much restraint on the reasons for going to war. As the 20th century ground on, there were more and more constraints, basically getting narrowed down to self-defense and to going to war in response to some request from the United Nations Security Council that one do so. The war on terror, both right from the outset in some ways, has weakened, even broken this trend, you might say, by steadily weakening the rules and restraints that had been built up around war. So the United States basically declared open season on terrorists, and to some extent, terrorists declared open season on each other and on civilian populations in many places. This kind of non-state wars in some places are fought with virtually no restraints at all. So you can and people do almost any appalling thing that comes to your mind in relation to the pursuit of these kinds of conflicts. So we're in a very odd-looking world at the moment where much of the conflict that's actually going on is almost entirely outside the bounds of the existing rules and restraints on war, although those rules and restraints do still apply pretty strongly in some other places. I mean, most obviously, say, within the EU. So the yellow card warning, this is a fairly recent event, but it's one to watch and think about as a possible big benchmark date in global military history. So to conclude, those are my 6 choices at the moment. I'm not quite sure that that's all the possible choices that there might be. So, or indeed you might think some of these are wrong. So one of the points of discussion would be, should we delete any of these? Or should we add any, or any missed out? I have a certain affection myself for including 1905. I'm sorry, this is one against Russia, but in a certain way, Japan's defeat of Russia in 1905 had a really big impact. It's not much remembered now, tended to get buried by the First World War. But you have to remember how much influence racist thinking had in those days before the First World War. And Japan's defeat of Russia had a huge impact on all of those who were inspired by race theory, because it suddenly removed the myth of white invincibility, and in that way inspired anti-colonial and anti-racist movements in many places. It showed that this seemingly huge, awesome military gap between a few modernized, industrialized countries and everybody else could in fact be closed by non-white peoples, and closed quite quickly. So to my mind, I'm not quite sure it's big enough to include in this set, but it makes me, I haven't given it up yet. So some of you out there might have other ideas of things that have been missed out. If you have any thoughts about the selection criteria by which an exercise like this could be approached, and we've done this backwards in the sense, partly because we're still at the fun stage of this, when we're just thinking it through and trying to get some idea of what the potentialities are. So we've started with the history, the global military history and the empirical side of things, and not really got a tremendously firm analytical framework in place for justifying this. So if any of you out there have ideas about the kind of criteria that we might use, that would be useful too. But basically, we hope that this kind of exercise will make people think differently about how to periodize IR in a global perspective. And we need this global perspective because the period of Western domination is coming to an end as we sit here talking about it. And therefore, we need to retool our discipline to think about things in a more global perspective. Those old dates of 1648 and all of that, they don't speak to people in many parts of the world. So we need some kind of convincing system of periodization that does. And maybe this is a start. So I look forward to hearing your questions and comments on this. Thank you.
Just a sec, I will turn the microphones on.
Thank you so much, Professor Buzan, for sharing your wonderful insights. I appreciate you taking the time to share these thoughts. Since you named 3 or 4 world wars, as I'm sure you know, Russo-Japanese War especially, which sometimes is referred to as the World War Zero, certainly plays a role as well, I would argue. So I wonder if we should give a word to Professor Looking first, to just share his thoughts on this now and then proceed from there, if that's okay.
Well, I have a question actually. Well, first, this is a great project, I would think, and very timely to change our attitude towards history, because when I studied at school I already saw that even in Russia, we studied, well, the percentage of the time that we used for European history is much bigger than the time that we use for China, you know, for Japan and generally Asia, and to say nothing of Africa, as if nothing happened there. So I think it's very important to do. I think that most criticism that you will have with this paper would be based on, you know, specific dates that you use, which I think is not that important. I think the idea of the very idea is very important, but specific dates can always be, I think, negotiable more or less, because, you know, people from Africa would say that in Africa it's more important. Some people from Asia would say that Asian battles were more important. So I'm not going to ask about any specific things, but I want to ask 2 more general things. One is that I'm not sure why you call it military history, because, for example, I give you an example as an expert on China. I know it better, of the Treaty of Nerchinsk. Well, Treaty of Nerchinsk, I agree, and we wrote in some of our books, for example, on Russian-Chinese relations, that it's a very important event, because even in Russian-Chinese history, it actually, this agreement was effective for about 200 or more years, which is, of course, makes it very important. But militarily, it proceeded by a few clashes. So militarily, the events that preceded and led to the Nerchinsk agreement were not very significant. So I thought maybe it should not be called military history, but like diplomatic history, or history of international relations in general, that you want to, where you want to change the timing and give new benchmarks. And the other question is that from your talk, I have an impression that you have like more benchmarks in the 20th century than, say, in the 17th century or 16th century. And don't we have a kind of, let's call it a bias of contemporaryism? Because it's closer to us, we think it's more important. But perhaps in ancient times, there were also many important battles that we think now are not that important as the ones that we know better. So that's my 2 questions.
Do you want me to answer those now, or collect some, or how do we play them?
I think it makes sense to answer them as we get them because, yeah.
All right, then quick answers to that. I think you're right, of course, that everybody will want to argue that their own patch is important. The key qualifier there is that these things have to be of global or at least systemic consequence, all right? So we don't care about the 30 Years' War because although it was a big event, millions died, lasted a long time, it was in Europe and it didn't much anybody else. We don't care about the Taiping Rebellion because, again, millions died, huge event, but it was only in China, so it doesn't really affect anybody else. I think in terms of why military history, partly seem to keep a control on it and partly because that's been, in a sense, the main trend in the existing set of benchmark dates. But I would beg to disagree with you about the Treaty of Nerchinsk, not in any of the details that you said, but the Treaty of Nerchinsk from this point of view is not about Russia and China fighting. Right? It's merely the fact that this is where their expanding borders met and they agreed to settle the borders. And the consequence was the closure of the steppe. Right? So the steppe people and that whole military dynamic, which had driven thousands of years of Eurasian history, was brought to an end. So it's in a sense not about Russia and China, and certainly not about their relationship with each other. It's about the elimination of the steppe as an independent force in world history, which it had been very centrally for a very long time. Are we biased towards the 20th century? Well, there's only one date in here for the 20th century, 1975. I mean, if you look at the standard set, 3 out of the 5 are in the 20th century. So at least we're making an improvement on that kind of presentism in that sense. I mean, that was one of the reasons for thinking of this in terms of the change in the military balance between core and periphery, because that has been such a big structuring thing in world politics since the 19th century.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So I wonder if Professor Karaganov, who joined us a little bit later, would like to say a couple of words as well. Well, if it's not yet, then Nikolai Petro also asked an excellent question in the chat. So if you could turn his microphone on, please.
Sorry, I came late, so I will refrain from asking the question. Though I enjoy, of course, the late part of your lecture, Dr. Professor Buzan, and as well as many of your work. Thank you very much, and of course, I'm closely watching the conversation. But I was late, so I'm shy to ask a question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So if we could give the word to Nikolai Petro, then please.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Well, my question had several steps. It seems to me that as you're laying out this periodization of international relations and thinking, I was wondering, based also on your earlier work, how much this mindset of how we view the events unfolding is contributing to the actual eruption of conflict. And you can actually perhaps even say military conflict. And if it does play such a role, our mutual understandings which do not coincide, has this role been constant over history? Or could it be that it's playing a different role today because of technology?
Can you give me an example of that?
Well, I'm thinking about it in modern terms. For example, I had occasion recently to reflect on the United States, I think, thinking of its major task in world affairs as maintaining its preeminence, that indeed is a good thing for the entire world, and would be conducive to stability. Whereas for a decade or more, it seems to me, intellectuals in other areas of the world have been thinking that hegemony is actually part of the problem. Are we seeing this converging to a direct conflict today? And could this have happened in the past?
Okay, it's an interesting question. I have to say I haven't thought about this, so this is just off the top of my head. I would certainly agree that that you're onto something here. That certainly the existing Eurocentric approaches to international relations, as many post-colonialists and others have pointed out, fundamentally lack respect for the rest of the world. They are, in a sense, a mirror image of the way in which the West and the other industrialized countries simply use the world as their battleground, without so much as a buy or leave in many respects, and that this is a problem. I think the one aspect of this that I have been thinking about a little bit is in terms of the emergence of a post-Western world. And again, it's kind of reflected in these dates, that the West and the other colonial powers have, well, by and large, forgotten about their colonialism. Russia may be a different case here because its colonialism was close to home. It's a bit more comparable to Britain and Ireland in that sense. But as the rest of the world becomes more equal in terms of not just wealth and power, but also cultural authority and cultural legitimacy, that colonial history has not been forgotten, and it is now attacked. I mean, you can see this in China very clearly, the way the Chinese hammer away at the idea of the century of humiliation. It's quite an important part of their propaganda line. And others, I am sure, feel the same about this, that the West and Japan seem to have either forgotten about their colonialism or only look back on it with a kind of nostalgia about their glorious imperial past. But the rest of the world, now becoming rich and powerful, hasn't. And in that sense, there is this historical baggage being carried around, which will greatly influence the ability of people to cooperate with each other in the emerging, more pluralistic world order that we're going to get, or possibly world disorder that is coming into being as we sit here. So I certainly think that that's a very good angle to be explored in this kind of thing, that there is a link there. I'd have to think long and hard to work it all out, but I certainly think it's something that would need to be looked at, yeah.
All right, thank you so much. So next we're going to give the floor to Dmitry Suslov, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Buzan. It's always a big pleasure to talk to someone whom we study in the university. And my thanks goes also to the faculty for arranging this meeting. I have a comment and two questions, if you allow. The comment is that first, it is a very timely thing that you are doing, because indeed the West centrism of international relations is over, and we have to be more global in our approach towards the history of international relations. This is a very important educational question also to the Russians, because the Russian students know quite well, European dynasties and European wars, but know nothing or almost nothing about the Asian ones and what was going on in the other regions. However, I think that the periodization that you offer is not a substitute, but as a very good supplement to the periodization that focuses on the Peace of Westphalia. Why? Because in my mind, the periodization that focuses on that starts from the Peace of Westphalia is not about big wars. It is about actors of international relations, right? Which actors become dominant, become the primary actors of international relations. And indeed, the Peace of Westphalia created the sovereign states. And eventually, sovereign states became global. Because after the collapse of the European colonialism, the non-Western countries, they chose to reproduce the West sovereign countries, mimicking the Western institutions, rather than reestablishing some medieval or whatever ancient state structures. So this Westphalia centrism from the perspective of actors is very, I think, correct. But this is just a different periodization from what you suggested. Now to my questions. My first question is about the demise of the Western military dominance in international relations, which surely happened in the second half of the 20th century. And the question is, where do you put Soviet Union? Because you said that the core lost the military dominance, right? Do you consider Soviet Union as part of the core or not a part of the core? Because if you consider Soviet Union not a part of the core, then it would probably be more correct to claim that the core lost its military dominance at the Cuban Missile Crisis, and with the establishment of the mutually assured destruction between the Soviet Union and the United States, because it is this moment when the United States concluded that they can simply not win a war against Soviet Union. Even after 1945, the United States could have easily destroyed, well, not very easily, but still destroyed the Soviet Union with their nuclear predominance. But it was not possible any longer since 1960s, basically, which then led to the overall, philosophy of nuclear deterrence, arms control, and so on and so forth. But if you do include Soviet Union into the core, then probably, again, I slightly disagree with 1975, right? I think that the end of the Western military dominance is now, is today only. Why? Because today, for the first time in history, the Western military superpower, which is the United States, claims that its major military adversary is a non-Western country, a non-Western power. This is China, and now it's official in all the official American documents. Vietnam, Afghanistan. We could also add to that the Suez Crisis, which was a big embarrassment for the British and French. Yes, of course, they lost. But still they had power, military power projection capability. Still, it was the US who invaded Vietnam, not Vietnam who invaded the United States. Still, it was a very specific type of war, which the United States and the Soviet Union lost, right? It was the counterinsurgency war. It was basically a war against the people, right? Whereas the ability to destroy the state, the adversarial army, still existed. But now I'm not sure that the United States could win against China, even if the war starts, right? And they officially recognize that, look, as they said in their military doctrine, for the first time there is no way for the United States, for the first time after the end of the Cold War, they are no longer able to project their military power anywhere, because China doesn't allow this, because Russia doesn't allow this, and so on and so forth. And they consider a non-Western great power as their primary military adversary. I think that's the deciding, the turning point in global history. And very briefly, in one sentence, my second question: what do you think about the future of great power wars? Do you think they are? Possible? Great power wars, because the traditional thinking is that nuclear weapons do not allow wars among nuclear great powers. Do you agree with this? And surely nuclear weapons will continue So how do you see the future of great power wars? Just to continue your periodization, you know, to project your periodization into the future. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for those questions. I'm not sure about your defense of Westphalia. I mean, I know where you're going with the idea that, okay, this produces the modern state, blah, 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 blah. I'm not very convinced by that argument on a couple of grounds. International relations as a discipline is very peculiar in taking 1648 as the beginning of modernity. You will search far and wide for any other discipline that thinks that, okay? For everybody else, modernity begins in the 19th century, and so does it for me. The kind of state, as it were, that went around the world is the national state, and also the rational state, and that's a phenomenon of the 19th century. Not, you know, in 1648, we're still talking about monarchical absolutist states. I'm also not convinced that the system, I mean, it's again another IR myth that we talk about states and that's what we talk about. But, you know, up until 1945, basically it was about empires. Some of them had a state at the heart of them, but the basic players were empires. One could argue that empires are still around. They're disguised as states. You know, is Russia an empire? Is China an empire? Is the United States an empire? You could make a case, right? And certainly some of those behave like empires in some ways, although they are also conscious of the fact that they're supposed to be disguised as states. So I'm not convinced by the argument for Westphalia. In terms of you know, where to locate Russia and the Soviet Union in all of this, of course it's a perennial debate, and we'll never have a resolution as to whether Russia should be thought of as part of the West or not. And things have gone back and forth on that. I mean, the Russians themselves have not made up their minds about it, and neither has anybody else. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they aren't, and that's an ongoing disagreement. That doesn't matter so much to what I'm trying to argue here, because I'm more concerned not so much about the West, but the core, right? So the industrialized core. Now, the industrialized core from the 19th century onward includes Russia, and it also includes Japan, right? Japan is always forgotten about in international relations, but Japan was a great power. And you say, you know, that there's a big turning point here because finally, you know, the United States has declared a non-Western power as its enemy. Hey, what about Japan, right? They fought a big war against Japan, and for a long time, Japan was that alien other, right? So, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, and I've argued this at length in various papers and books, Japan is in on modernity right from the beginning, right? Japan achieves modernity at about the same time and pace as Russia does and as Italy does. It's a bit behind Germany and the US, which are themselves a bit behind Britain, but they're all in that first group. And then there's nobody until the 1970s, okay? So I don't have a problem with that group being non-Western, but the West was and still is a very big chunk of it. I see the core, basically the way I see, or one of the ways in which I see the world going is that the core is getting bigger, having been artificially small for a long time. It's getting bigger. So China is moving into the core, you know, Russia has been there, others are moving into the core. So the core is getting bigger and the periphery smaller. That's a very important changing balance in the world. On the question of the future of great power war, my view on this hasn't changed for a long time. I think nuclear weapons and other extremely expensive weapons of mass destruction make great power war irrational, not to say stupid. Right? And I think that remains the case, right? and is going to remain the case. It doesn't mean that it's impossible. Right? one should never rule out stupidity, the possibility of accident. So there's always a chance that such a war could occur, but it's a very small chance. And in that sense, I think the world has done a flip from war as normal behavior and something that you might actually be able to win and therefore might be rational to do, to war as something that you really rather desperately want to avoid because you can't win, not an all-out great power war. That's just not the way things are going to be done. It doesn't seem to me that the behavior, if anything, we've got the opposite problem at the moment, that nobody wants to rule the world, all right? The Americans are kind of giving up and Trump is saying, let's all go home. The Chinese don't want the job because they say, oh, we're still a developing country. We can't afford to have all these responsibilities. And India has the same kind of message. The EU is completely concerned with its own internal affairs and has relatively little scope for foreign and strategic policy. And basically Russia doesn't have the money or the friends indeed to do this. So Russia isn't taking on any other great powers for sure. Nobody wants to run the world and nobody wants to compete to run the world, whereas that's exactly what they used to want to do. So in a sense, that also reduces the risk of war in the system.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Just today, I listened to a talk on YouTube by Professor Buzan on that topic as well. So I can send it to Dmitry.
Sorry to be boring, you've heard it all twice.
No, it's fascinating stuff. We have so many excellent questions in the chat, but I have to be a bit selective. So I wanted to give the floor to Anne Phillips, if that's okay.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much. And my question really is tangentially related to your presentation, and that is, I was very much intrigued when you made the comment early on that you wanted to move away from a Western-centric as well as a militarized periodization of historical development. I think both of those are extremely important. And you mentioned briefly that, for example, the onset of modernity in the 1840s, I think would be one. So I was interested in what other elements or critical developments you would identify for taking a fresh approach to historical development. In many ways, of course, I used to teach IR and so on, and we looked at the great, quote, men of history, the great wars and so on. And there's been a lot of shift away from that to social forces, etc. So that was my question. What other elements would you include as decisive for international development and international relations? Thank you.
Okay. A nice small question there. How long have we got? Not long, I suspect. This was, in a sense, the burden of what George Lawson and I were trying to do in our book in 2015, looking at the 19th century, and that was, in a sense, what provided the material for us to start thinking about benchmark dates, because the 19th century is full of huge events which completely change the nature of international relations, which hardly register at all unless you happen to be studying IPE. So you'll notice that the conventional set of benchmark dates skips from 1815, which is itself not much used, straight to 1914, as if nothing happened in the 19th century. But lots of things happened in the 19th century. So, I mean, amongst the various things that we discussed there, I mean, a whole set of new ideologies comes about, what we call ideologies of progress. So liberalism, socialism, nationalism, and scientific racism all come into play and reshape in very substantial ways how IR is thought about and practiced. And there are huge breakthroughs in technology that don't produce any great war. I mean, they eventually come out in the First World War, but they transform society in all kinds of very fundamental ways. And there's the rise of the market, what I like to think of as market ideology, if I could use that term. The idea that the market is a principle of governance, if you will, that a great deal of stuff can be taken out of the hands of government by declaring the market as a governing principle and letting it operate in that way. That's a very 19th century idea and became very influential during the 19th century and had huge global impacts. So it seems to me you can look at material things, you can look at ideational things, and you can find lots of stuff which is transformational in relation to IR. For the time being, for example, you could make the argument that what I'd call environmental stewardship is becoming, or indeed has become in some ways, a new primary institution of international society. It's a different way of thinking about how everything relates to everything else on the planet, and it simply wasn't there before. And the more seriously it gets taken, the more it changes the way we not only think about things, but the way we do business. So I think there's all kinds of stuff out there that can and should be brought into this process of benchmarking. It doesn't make it easy because it gives you, as you'll see if you look at the article that George and I did a while back, how do you then aggregate these different kinds of things? It makes the process of benchmarking quite complicated, but it's still a very interesting exercise to think through. So I'm not suggesting that these other things should drive out the military concerns. They should accompany them, but that it doesn't make it simple to identify benchmark dates by doing that.
Thank you so much. So we don't have much time, so I'm going to have to choose just a couple of more questions. One of them is Sergei Trush, please.
Thank you, Professor Buzan, for very interesting talk. You are the prominent name in the field and known for your encyclopedic knowledge of IR history. But my question is to you as more to a political thinker than a historian. So globalization drives countries and societies close. But globalization is not excluding competition between societies and states. And this competition is being a struggle for power in the changing multipolar world is being based on competition being based on national specifics, national histories, and national ideologies. And well, the information warfare that are taking place in the context of the information revolution is driving to this situation where these ideologies produce a lot of fake, distorted realities in which countries and big powers are living and building their political strategies. So this current quarrel over the COVID disease is just one of the nearest example of that. So I'm just curious about your general reflection on this situation, and what is the role of political science and international relations theory in trying to going out of this dangerous stalemate? Thank you.
Okay. Well, I would certainly agree that globalization doesn't exclude competition. I mean, any Marxist text on capitalism will tell you that, that aspect of things is certainly alive and well, and any realist will tell you the same. And I don't dispute that. It does seem to me that we've been through a few decades in which globalization made great advances, particularly economic globalization, and we've now, to some extent, hit the buffers on that for all kinds of reasons. I mean, Robert Skidelsky argues rightly, I think, that the problem with having a global economy without having a global government is at the moment unsustainable. We can't have a global government, and yet we seem to be trying to make a global economy without one, and it doesn't work. It's too unstable. It can be made to work for a while, but basically a system of rules and management agreements and such like is too fragile. It might be argued that the current crisis over COVID-19 is contributing to this deglobalizing trend, because everybody's looking around and thinking, bloody hell, we've had all of these kind of extremely long extended supply chains and very lean and efficient delivery systems and such like, and that works fine as long as everything is okay. But throw a little crisis in, like COVID-19, and suddenly the weaknesses of this system are very apparent. So what I called market ideology is taking a beating on this. So maybe we should run things a little less efficiently in economic terms in order to have more robustness in the face of these kinds of crises. It could also be argued that this kind of economic globalization reflected a particular historical phase in which there was a big advantage in pursuing cheap labor if you were a manufacturer, and that thus we had these complicated global chains. And that this was tremendous in the sense that it enabled the Chinese and a lot of other people to industrialize on the back of this kind of global division of labor. That period may also be coming to an end. That the rise of automated production and artificial intelligence and all that sort of thing looks, to my mind, to be well set to undermine the comparative advantage of cheap labor, and therefore those industries can more easily be brought back to whatever their homelands are. This is, you could argue whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, but it's certainly going to pull up a key development ladder for a lot of countries that have not yet gone onto it. So it seems to me globalization is something that goes in waves. At the moment, we're in a deglobalizing wave, and I don't know how far that will go. It's a kind of dialectical process. I think you have to push it and see how far it goes, and then adjust when it produces problems, and so you get a kind of a wave pattern. But it will always, I think, remain competitive. We're a long way away from any kind of system of harmony, and I have no intention of arguing, however much I might like to see such a system, I have no intention of arguing that it's just around the corner.
All right, thank you so much. I think the last question in the series would be Vasily Kashin, please. Vasily, are you with us?
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Buzan. Just a short comment concerning Nerchinsk Treaty as benchmark. Like the closure of steppe, the last major steppe military empire was Jungaria, and they have been fighting with Chinese and sometimes being a major problem for them until 1758 when they were crushed. So maybe maybe this would be better benchmark for the elimination of steppe as military power, or what do you think about that? And second, what do you think about the relative importance of technological and organizational innovation in military before the industrialization? Because it seems that before early or mid-19th century, real innovation which transformed the military happened not in technological field, but in tactics and organization, and like especially in the ground warfare, like emergence of the European professional infantry in 15th century, then square columns, then introduction of new types of cavalry, etc., maneuverable artillery, etc. So that was the key transformative factor in which gave the West the advantage. What do you think about that? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I would see that case where the Qing had still some difficulties with the barbarians, as they were called up there after the Treaty of Nerchinsk. That's a kind of, I think, a relatively minor aftershock. The key is the closure of the steppe, right? Then the Russians run part of it and the Chinese run part of it. And for the most part, the Chinese are successful in controlling the steppe. There's one rebellious group of Mongols who don't like the Chinese control, and they have a go at in terms of your question about the organization of the military. I think that's fairly clear that up until the Industrial Revolution's flower in the 19th century, you do get occasional military developments that are quite decisive in restructuring things, but they don't come along very often. Right? So, I mean, the compound bow and the chariot, if you want to go way back when, had a huge effect and forced the sedentary civilizations to reconfigure their armies, or indeed to hire steppe warriors to defend them against other steppe warriors. Things like iron weapons, armor, that kind of stuff. You could even think, if you want to go through the history of the gunpowder revolution, that had a pretty big impact on fortifications, on the organization of infantry. So you organize your infantry differently if you've got gunpowder weapons than you do if you've got pikemen and crossbowmen and all of that kind of stuff. So there were periodic technological impacts, but I think but then long periods of nothing. I mean, you know, a Roman soldier at the beginning of the Roman Empire looks not too different from a Greek hoplite, and not much different from a Roman soldier at the end of the Roman Empire. So there are long periods when not much happens. What's interesting about the 1840 date is that that's also a pretty good date for when a dynamic of continuous technological improvement kicks in. Okay? And this destabilizes relations amongst the great powers, because if you don't keep up with this technological dynamic, you risk losing the next war. Okay? And you can see this pretty clearly. There's not too much work done on it, but industrial arms racing really kicks in between Britain and France from the 1840s onwards, where the British are in a continuous panic that the French might get some combination of steam-powered armored warships that would enable them to cross the Channel and thereby use their big army effectively against Britain, which didn't have a big army. Those kinds of concerns from 1840 onwards became continuous, and they remain continuous. So it was a complete redefinition of things, and thus you find, now later story, U.S. Marines are reorganizing themselves to be something completely different from what they have been before, because it's a new kind of environment with a new kind of weaponry and a new kind of opponents. So that process becomes continuous from 1840. We might think, oh my God, we live in a time of just amazing, quick military change, but we've been living in that time since 1840. And in some ways, for those who were at the beginning of it, the changes were even bigger than they are to us now. I mean, think of the transformation of naval power from wood and sail to iron and steam, just huge. So if you look at the building programs of the naval powers in the later 19th century, they only built about one or two of each type of ship, because they knew while they were building it that by the time it was finished, it would be obsolete. That's a different world from everything that came before that.
Right, thank you so much. I'm sure everyone here would share my opinion that we would have loved for this discussion to go on for much, much longer. However, we have to finish soon. It was a great pleasure and honor for us to have Barry Buzan, one of the greatest scholars with a world reputation, who is interested in such an extraordinary range of subjects, from power transition to international relations and everything else, I would say. Thank you so much for taking time to talk to us about where the world is and where it's heading. And some of the chat questions we haven't had a chance to discuss, but I have saved them and I'm going to forward them to Professor Buzan, just in case.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the efficient chairing of the meeting. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.